A filthy, limping stray is dragged toward a rope, and a poor boy steps in. No money, no backup, just a shaking hand and a promise. Not today. But the moment he shelters the dog, the town's most feared man takes notice. Strange things start to happen. The dog freezes at the smell of gasoline, locks eyes on one pair of boots, and scratches at a scar like it's hiding a code. Storm clouds gather, chains rattle, and a dark shack hums with secrets someone is ready to burn. The boy has one shot to prove the truth and pull the dog out alive before the evidence goes up in smoke and the wrong people walk free. What's buried under that scar? And how far will the boy go when doing the right thing could get them both killed? The winter wind whistled through the empty streets of the river town, carrying the sharp smell of rust and coal smoke. Harlan Pike pulled his thin jacket tighter, his stomach growling as he made his way past the salvage yard's chain-link fence. The last bits of a day-old hamburger from the diner's kitchen sat wrapped in his pocket, payment for sweeping the floors after closing. Movement caught his eye. Through the gathering dusk, he spotted a dog skulking between the twisted metal heaps. Its ash-gray coat was matted with dirt, and it moved with a pronounced limp, keeping close to the shadows. Something about its careful movements tugged at Harlan's heart. "Here you go, boy," he whispered, reaching for the burger wrapper. The dog's head snapped up, amber eyes glowing with a mix of hunger and fear. Before Harlan could toss the food, harsh voices cut through the evening air. Two men in stained work clothes appeared from behind a stack of crushed cars, uncoiling a length of rope. "Got you now, you worthless mutt," the taller one growled. "Boss needs new bait for tonight." The dog pressed itself against the fence, trembling. Harlan saw old scars crisscrossing its muzzle, one ear torn and badly healed. Without thinking, he stepped between the men and the frightened animal. "Leave him alone," Harlan said, his voice steadier than his pounding heart. The men pulled up short, surprised by his appearance. The shorter one laughed, an ugly sound. "Kid, that ain't your concern. That's Kellerman's property." "I don't see any collar," Harlan replied, standing his ground despite his shaking knees. "He's just a stray." The taller man's face darkened. "Listen here, boy. Brant Kellerman owns this yard, and what he says goes. You don't want to make trouble with him." He took a menacing step forward. "Walk away now, and we'll forget we saw you." Harlan didn't move. Behind him, he could hear the dog's ragged breathing. The shorter man spat on the ground and grabbed his partner's arm. "Leave it, Jake. Ain't worth the hassle. We'll get another one." He shot Harlan a cold look. "But you remember what we said about Kellerman, kid. You don't want him noticing you." They backed away, the rope dragging in the gravel. Harlan waited until they disappeared around the corner before letting out a shaky breath. His hands trembled as he turned to the dog, who watched him with wary eyes. "It's okay," he said softly, crouching down and pulling out the wrapped burger. "I won't hurt you." The dog's nose twitched at the smell of food, but it stayed pressed against the fence. Harlan slowly unwrapped the burger and broke off a piece, placing it on the ground before backing away a few steps. Minutes passed in tense silence before hunger won out over fear. The dog crept forward, snatched the meat, and retreated, but not quite as far this time. "That's it," Harlan encouraged, breaking off another piece. "You're safe now." Bit by bit, the burger created a trail, leading the dog away from the salvage yard. Each time the animal came closer, Harlan could see more details. The ribs showing through its coat, the way it favored its right front paw, the intelligence in those amber eyes despite their haunted look. The dog flinched at every sudden movement, every distant sound, but something in its posture had begun to soften. "You need a name," Harlan murmured, noting how the gray fur was dusted with dirt and grit. "How about gravel?" It fits you." The dog's ears twitched at the sound of his voice. Taking the last bite of burger, Harlan led him away from the yard, toward the back of the laundromat where the vents pumped out warm air all night. There was a sheltered spot behind the dumpsters where Harlan sometimes slept during the worst winter nights. "You can stay here," he told Gravel, watching as the dog investigated the space, nose working overtime. "It's not much, but it's safer than over there." The dog settled into the corner, still alert but no longer trembling. Its eyes stayed fixed on Harlan, not quite trusting but no longer seeing him as a threat. Each time a car passed or voices drifted from the street, Gravel's muscles tensed, ready to bolt. But he stayed, curled in the warm air from the vents, occasionally licking his injured paw. Harlan sat nearby, giving the dog space while keeping watch. He knew he should head back to his own sleeping spot, but something held him there. Maybe it was the way Gravel's eyes followed his every movement, or maybe it was the memory of those men with their rope and cruel intentions. Whatever the reason, he couldn't shake the feeling that this moment, this simple act of stepping between danger and something vulnerable, had shifted something important in his world. As the night deepened and the temperature dropped, Harlan finally stood to leave. "I'll bring more food tomorrow," he promised. Gravel's head lifted at his movement, but the dog made no attempt to follow or flee. Progress, Harlan thought. Small but real. Walking home through the quiet streets, Harlan couldn't forget the men's warning about Brant Kellerman. Everyone knew Kellerman owned half the town. But what did he want with a wounded stray? Whatever the reason, Harlan knew in his bones it wasn't good. His mother used to say that doing the right thing was rarely easy, but always worth it. He hoped she was right, because something told him helping this dog would prove to be anything but easy. The morning sun hadn't yet burned through the fog when Harlan returned to the laundromat with a borrowed bucket and a sliver of stolen soap. Gravel was exactly where he'd left him, curled tight against the wall, but his tail thumped once against the concrete when he saw Harlan approach. "Morning, buddy," Harlan said softly, setting down the bucket. "You're pretty filthy. Let's fix that." He filled the bucket from the spigot behind the building, letting the water run until it was lukewarm. Gravel watched every movement, muscles tense but no longer trembling. Progress came in small steps. "Easy now," Harlan murmured, approaching with a wet rag. The first touch made Gravel flinch, but he didn't pull away. As Harlan gently worked the soap through the matted fur, his fingers found a map of old hurts, ridged scars across the shoulders, a patch of missing fur on the flank, places where the skin had healed wrong after what must have been deep cuts. The water in the bucket turned dark with dirt and dried blood. Harlan worked carefully around the fresh bruises, talking softly the whole time. "You've been through it, haven't you? But that's done now. Nobody's going to hurt you anymore." When he finished, Gravel looked like a different dog. His ash-gray coat was almost silver in places, though still patchy with old injuries. But it was the way he held himself that had changed most. Straighter, somehow, as if being clean had restored something of his dignity. "Come on," Harlan said, standing slowly. "I know somewhere we can get you real help." The walk to the shelter took 20 minutes, with frequent stops when Gravel's limp slowed him down. The building was a low brick structure with a faded mural of paw prints along one wall. Inside, the smell of disinfectant mixed with the sound of barking from the back rooms. A woman looked up from behind the front desk, dark circles under her eyes suggesting she'd been there since early morning. Her name tag read, Roslyn Park. "Can I help you?" she asked, then noticed Gravel. Her expression shifted to concern. "Oh my, what happened to this one?" "Found him yesterday," Harlan explained. "Some men were trying to catch him with a rope. He's hurt and needs help." Rosalind came around the desk, moving slowly as she crouched to examine Gravel. The dog allowed her touch, though his eyes never left Harlan. "These injuries. Some are old, some new. Has he been fighting?" "I don't know. He was near Kellerman Salvage Yard." "Kellerman?" Something flickered across Rosalind's face. She straightened up, her voice turning professional. "Well, I can help, but there are procedures. Stray intake has a 72-hour hold period before we can officially process them. After that..." She left the sentence unfinished. "After that what?" Rosalind sighed. "After that, if no one claims them and we're full, which we usually are, we have to make hard decisions. There's also an intake fee of $50. Harlan's stomach dropped. $50 might as well have been $5,000. He had exactly $2.13 in his pocket, saved from returning soda bottles. I can get it," he said, though his voice wavered. "Just give me a minute." Outside, he leaned against the wall, trying to think. $50. What did he own worth $50? The answer came with a sharp pain in his chest. In his back pocket, wrapped in an old bandana, was his father's wrench, the only thing he'd managed to keep after everything fell apart. His father's hands had worn smooth spots in the metal from years of use at the mill. The pawn shop was 3 blocks away. Mr. Chen barely looked at the wrench before offering $45. Harlan bargained him up to $50, each dollar feeling like a betrayal. When he returned to the shelter, Rosalind was filling out paperwork. She glanced at the crumpled bills he placed on the counter, but didn't comment on their origin. "This buys him 7 days," she explained. "After that, there's a daily care fee." "I'll figure something out," Harlan said. Can I see him?" She led him to a small kennel where Gravel lay on a thin blanket, looking smaller somehow in the institutional setting. A bowl of water and another of kibble sat untouched in the corner. "Hey," Harlan whispered, kneeling by the chain-link door. Gravel's tail thumped against the blanket. "I had to leave you here for a bit, but it's just temporary. You're not just another stray, and I'm going to prove it." He pressed his fingers through the fence, and Gravel stretched his neck to touch them with his nose. Both of them knew something about being left behind, about making do with what life handed you. But maybe that's what made their connection stronger. Not the comfort of an easy life, but the understanding that came from sharing its hardships. "I'll be back tomorrow," Harlan promised. Gravel's eyes, heavy with exhaustion but still alert, watched him until he turned the corner at the end of the hallway. In the lobby, Rosalind was finishing the intake forms. "He's lucky you found him," she said without looking up. "Most people would have walked past." "Most people did," Harlan replied. He hesitated at the door. "Thank you for helping him." She nodded, her pen scratching against paper as she logged the time. 72 hours. The clock was ticking. The next morning dawned gray and cold. Harlan walked to the shelter with his hands stuffed in his pockets, shoulders hunched against the wind. His fingers kept searching for the familiar shape of his father's wrench, finding only empty space. When he pushed open the shelter door, voices spilled out from Rosalind's office. One was loud, demanding, a voice used to being obeyed. "That dog's mine, Miss Park. Got the papers right here." Harlan froze in the doorway. Through the office window, he could see Brant Kellerman's bulk filling a plastic chair, his weathered face fixed in what might have been a smile. 2 men lounged against the wall behind him, the same ones who'd tried to rope Gravel. Rosalind held a paper, her expression carefully neutral. "These registration papers are quite recent, Mr. Kellerman." "Filed them late, that's all. Been meaning to do it for months." Kellerman's laugh scraped like gravel. "Boy, there knows it's my dog, don't you, son?" All eyes turned to Harlan. His throat went dry, but he managed to speak. "That's not true. You hurt him. I saw your men trying to catch him with a rope." "Now that hurts my feelings." Kellerman stood, his shadow stretching across the floor. "Just trying to catch my lost pet. You understand how it is, Ms. Park. People get attached to their animals." One of his men, the shorter one with a scar above his eye, smirked. "Real useful stock, that one. Shame to lose him." "Useful?" Rosalind's voice sharpened. "For what exactly?" "Training," Kellerman cut in smoothly. "He's got good instincts. Now, about processing my claim." Rosalind's fingers tightened on the papers. "There's a mandatory waiting period, and given the dog's condition—" "The law says 72 hours, Kellerman interrupted. "Then he's mine again, unless someone's got proof otherwise?" His gaze settled on Harlan like a weight. The taller man peeled himself off the wall and walked over to Harlan. "Smart kids know when to let things go," he said quietly. "Especially strays, both the four-legged kind and other sorts." Heat rushed to Harlan's face. "He's not yours. Look at his scars. Look what you did to him." "Harlan," Rosalind's voice held a warning. "Mr. Kellerman has filed a legal claim, without contrary evidence. But maybe we should talk outside," the tall man suggested, his hand settling heavily on Harlan's shoulder. They steered him through the door. Once outside, the shorter man grabbed Harlan's collar and pushed him against the brick wall. "Listen good, kid. That dog's got a job to do. He makes us money. You interfere again, we'll make sure you regret it." "Fighting," Harlan spat. "You use him for fighting." The man's grip tightened. "Prove it. Go ahead. Try. But remember, next time you see that mutt, he might not be so lucky. Accidents happen in fights all the time." They left him there, trembling with rage and fear. Through the window, he could see Kellerman finishing his paperwork, that same false smile in place. When Harlan went back inside, Rosalind was sitting at her desk, looking tired. "I'm sorry," she said. "Without proof of abuse or prior ownership, my hands are tied. The law's wrong," Harlan cut in. "You know what they do to dogs like him." "I know, but knowing isn't the same as proving." She met his eyes. "Be careful, Harlan. Men like that, they don't play by rules." He spent the rest of the day with Gravel, watching the dog sleep fitfully in his kennel. Each time footsteps passed in the hallway, Gravel's ears would twitch, and he'd press closer to the chain link where Harlan's fingers poked through. "I won't let them take you," Harlan promised. But the words felt hollow. That night, while the town slept, metal groaned and concrete crumbled. The shelter's back door, with its aging lock, gave way under the force of a crowbar. Heavy boots moved through dark corridors. A dog whimpered once, then fell silent. Morning light revealed the damage. Rosalind's hands shook as she dialed the police. "Break-in. Yes, overnight. One dog missing. The locks completely destroyed." Harlan stood in front of the empty kennel, staring at the abandoned blanket. The water bowl had been knocked over, leaving a dark stain on the concrete floor. His chest felt too tight to breathe. "They took him," he whispered. "They took him back." Rosalind touched his shoulder gently. "The police are coming. We'll file a report." But Harlan barely heard her. All he could think about were those scars, the way Gravel flinched at sudden movements. How the man had said, "Accidents happen in fights all the time." This was his fault. He'd tried to save Gravel, but instead, he'd led Kellerman right to him. The empty kennel seemed to mock his promise of protection. Somewhere in the gray morning, dogs were fighting. Somewhere, Gravel was back in the hands of men who saw him only as useful stock. And Harlan had nothing left. Not his father's wrench, not his promises, not even the chance to make things right. Harlan knelt on the cold concrete floor, his fingers tracing the chaos of prints left behind. Boot marks crisscrossed everywhere, heavy treads that told of the violence from the night before. The harsh fluorescent lights overhead cast shadows that made each impression stand out in stark relief against the gray surface. His knees ached from the hard floor, but he barely noticed, too focused on what was before him. But among them, something else caught his eye, something that made his pulse quicken. Gravel's paw prints made their own story. They circled one particular set of boots over and over, marking something different about those steps. The prints had a strange sheen to them, almost oily. Harlan leaned closer, the concrete's chill seeping through his worn jeans. The pattern was unmistakable. Gravel hadn't been running randomly. He'd been fixated on these specific boot prints. "Rosalind," he called out, his voice echoing in the empty shelter corridor. "Come look at this." She appeared from the office doorway, clipboard still in hand, and crouched beside him, her ponytail falling forward as she studied the floor. The sleeve of her coffee-stained scrubs brushed against his arm as she leaned in to examine the marks. "These prints, they smell like—" She wrinkled her nose, her sharp eyes narrowing. "Like chemicals, something industrial." "Gas," Harlan said, quietly, the word barely more than a whisper. "Remember how Gravel acted yesterday when we passed those fuel cans? He went crazy, trying to get away. It wasn't just fear, it was recognition." Rosalind's face changed, her professional composure slipping into something more troubled. She stood up, pacing the narrow corridor, her sneakers squeaking against the clean parts of the floor. "That reminds me of something." She stopped, her fingers fidgeting with her pen. "The old mill collapse last year, the one where—" She stopped, glancing at Harlan, compassion softening her features. "Where my dad died," he finished for her. His throat felt tight, a familiar knot forming that he'd learned to swallow around. "What about it?" The memory flashed unbidden, his father's work boots by the door, never to be filled again. The official letter with words like tragic accident and structural failure. "There was a fire first," Rosalind said carefully. "Insurance investigators couldn't prove anything, but everyone knew it wasn't natural. The timing was too convenient, and somehow Kellerman made money off it, bought up the land cheap, then sold it to developers for triple the price. My mother used to say it stank worse than week-old garbage." Harlan remembered Gravel's reaction to the gas cans, the way he'd pressed against Harlan's legs, trembling. The ash-gray dog's amber eyes had gone wide with panic, his scarred muzzle pulling back in what looked like fear. But now Harlan recognized it as something else entirely. Not just fear, he realized now. Training. What if— He chose his words carefully, the theory forming as he spoke. What if Gravel wasn't just used for fighting? What if he was trained for something else, something specific? Like what? Rosalind's brow furrowed, her clipboard now forgotten at her side. I don't know yet. But pieces were starting to fit together in his mind, clicking into place like tumblers in a lock. The way Kellerman's men had called Gravel useful stock rather than just another fighting dog. How desperate they'd been to get him back. More desperate than made sense for an ordinary fighting dog. The strange way Gravel reacted to certain smells. After Rosalind went to deal with the police, providing her statement about the break-in, Harlan slipped out through the shelter's side door. The afternoon sun hit his face, but brought no warmth to the chill that had settled in his bones. His feet carried him towards the salvage yard, but this time he stayed across the railroad tracks, hidden behind a stack of old pallets. The splinters dug into his palms as he peered through the gaps. The yard looked different in daylight, less threatening, but somehow more sinister in its ordinary appearance. Rusted car frames stacked like children's discarded toys, mountains of twisted metal catching the sun's glare, workers moving through it all with the casual indifference of routine. A small shack stood at the far end, its windows dirty, with age and neglect. Nothing special about it except Harlan remembered seeing lights there late at night, long after the yard should have been closed. He'd assumed it was security, but now he wasn't so sure. The building sat apart from the main operations, isolated enough to be private but not so remote as to draw attention. He watched throughout the afternoon, his stomach growling as lunch came and went. Trucks came and went. Men loaded scrap metal, normal salvage yard business. But as the sun began to set, painting the sky in bruised purples and angry reds, he noticed something odd. While most workers headed home, lunch pails in hand and dust coating their clothes, a few stayed behind. They carried things into the shack, things too small to make out from his hiding spot, but handled with unusual care for a place that dealt in junk. The lights came on inside the shack, yellow and dim through the grime-streaked windows. Through those grimy windows, shadows moved with purpose. Training, they'd said. But training for what? The question burned in his mind like a hot coal. Harlan's hands curled into fists, fingernails biting into his palms. He knew no adult would believe him, not without proof. The police would see a kid with a wild story and pat him on the head before sending him home. Rosalind wanted to help, but she was bound by rules and regulations that Kellerman seemed to slip through like water through cupped hands. If he wanted to save Gravel, really save him this time, he'd have to find evidence himself. Real evidence that showed exactly what Kellerman and his men were doing. The kind that couldn't be explained away or dismissed. His mind went back to those boot prints, to Gravel's desperate circling, to the smell of gasoline that had made the dog's muscles tense with recognition, to the memory of a mill fire that had taken his father, leaving behind only questions that no one seemed interested in answering. Something bigger was happening here, something that went beyond dogfighting, beyond even ordinary cruelty. And somewhere in that yard, behind those dirty windows, Gravel was being forced back into whatever dark purpose Kellerman had trained him for. The thought of the scarred dog's intelligent amber eyes clouded with fear made something harden in Harlan's chest. Harlan stood up, brushing dirt from his knees, his decision made. The evening air had grown cold, but he barely felt it. He couldn't fight Kellerman's men with his fists, couldn't break rules like they did. But he could watch, could gather proof, could show everyone what was really happening in that salvage yard, piece by careful piece. He owed Gravel that much. Owed it to himself, too. And maybe, in some way he couldn't quite articulate, he owed it to his father as well. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting long shadows across the salvage yard. Harlan's heart hammered in his chest as he crouched behind a stack of crushed cars, waiting for the last worker to leave. The metal beneath his fingers felt cold and sharp, like everything else in this place. He'd watched the yard all afternoon, memorizing the guard patterns. Now, in the growing darkness, he slipped through a gap in the chain-link fence where rust had eaten away the links. The hole was small, perfect for a skinny 14-year-old who hadn't eaten properly in days. Gravel's scent caught his attention first, that familiar mix of dust and fear. Following it, Harlan crept between towers of twisted metal and discarded machinery. Every step felt too loud, every shadow a potential threat. The shack loomed ahead, its windows now dark. And there, chained to a post beside it, was Gravel. The dog lay curled tight against the cold ground, a heavy chain around his neck. Even from here, Harlan could see fresh bruises on his ribs. "Gravel," he whispered, barely louder than the evening wind. "Hey, boy." The dog's head lifted. One ear, the torn one, twitched. Recognition flickered in those amber eyes, and Gravel's tail stirred against the dirt. "I'm coming," Harlan breathed. "Just hold on." "Well, look what we got here." The voice hit like a physical blow. Before Harlan could run, rough hands seized his shoulders. He found himself slammed against the cold side of a junked truck, the impact driving the air from his lungs. Two of Kellerman's men held him there, the same ones who'd tried to rope Gravel that first day. Their grips felt like iron bands around his arms. "Thought we told you to stay away, kid," one growled. Behind them, Gravel exploded into motion. The chain went taut as he lunged forward, barking furiously. The sound wasn't the fearful whimper Harlan had grown used to. This was deeper, trained, a guard dog's warning. "Shut that mud up!" A third man's boot caught Gravel in the ribs. The dog yelped, collapsing into silence. Harlan thrashed against the hands holding him, tasting blood where he'd bitten his lip. "Hey!" A new voice cut through the darkness. Red and blue lights suddenly painted the yard in harsh colors. "What's going on here?" Deputy Calder Finch emerged from his patrol car, flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. His weathered face showed nothing as he took in the scene. The men holding Harlan, Gravel's crumpled form, the fresh bruise forming on Harlan's cheek. "Evening, Deputy." Brant Kellerman appeared from the shadows, adjusting his jacket like this was a business meeting. "Just caught this young man trespassing. My men were removing him." "By slamming him into a truck?" Finch's voice stayed neutral, but his eyes narrowed. "They were just protecting my property." Kellerman's smile never reached his eyes. "You know how it is with kids these days. No respect for private property." Harlan met the deputy's gaze. "That dog, they stole him from the shelter. They're hurting him." "The dog is mine," Kellerman cut in smoothly. "Properly registered and everything. Check the records." Finch looked between them, the successful businessman and the scrawny kid with holes in his shoes. Harlan saw the moment the deputy made his choice. "Let him go," Finch ordered the men. They released Harlan, who stumbled but stayed standing. "Son," the deputy said, not unkindly, "you need to stay away from here. Next time I might have to arrest you for trespassing. Understand?" Harlan barely heard him. He watched as one of Kellerman's men dragged Gravel toward the shack. The dog's eyes never left Harlan's face. "Yes, sir," he managed. "I'll escort him out," Finch said to Kellerman. "Make sure he gets home safe." As the deputy led him toward the gate, shame burned in Harlan's chest. He'd failed again. Worse, he'd let them hurt Gravel while trying to help him. But as they reached the fence, that shame crystallized into something harder, something that felt like fury, but colder, more focused. They'd beaten him tonight, but they hadn't stopped him. And next time, he wouldn't come unprepared. Next time, he'd find a way to prove what they were doing. Next time, he'd get Gravel out for good, even if he had to do it alone. Harlan limped into the shelter the next morning, his bruises aching with each step. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as he pushed through the front door, making the shadows under his eyes look even darker. His ribs protested with each shallow breath, and the cut on his lip had crusted over during the night, pulling uncomfortably whenever he spoke. Rosalind looked up from her desk, coffee cup frozen halfway to her mouth. Her eyes widened as they took in his battered appearance. "Oh my God, Harlan, what happened to you?" "I found him," Harlan said, ignoring her question. His voice was rough but determined. The words scraped against his dry throat. "Gravel. He's at the salvage yard. But I couldn't—" His throat tightened, emotion threatening to choke him. "I couldn't get him out." The admission felt like another failure weighing on his shoulders. Rosalind set down her cup with a sharp click, concern etched across her features. The familiar scent of disinfectant and kibble hung in the air as she rushed around the desk. "Sit down before you fall down." She pulled up a chair, then grabbed her first aid kit from the shelf behind her. As she dabbed at the cut on his cheek with antiseptic, her hands were gentle but her voice was firm. "Tell me everything. Don't leave anything out." While she worked, Harlan explained about sneaking into the yard, finding Gravel, and the confrontation that followed. The memory of Gravel's terrified eyes made his stomach clench. The cold metal links of the chain, the desperate way the dog had tried to protect him despite his own fear. It all tumbled out in halting sentences. When he described the deputy's response, Rosalind's lips pressed into a thin line, her nostrils flaring with barely contained anger. "There might be another way," she said finally, closing the first aid kit with a decisive snap. "Something we should have checked. Earlier." She crossed to a cabinet and pulled out a handheld device, black and rectangular with a small screen. "This is our chip scanner. Every dog that comes through here gets scanned, but with Gravel, we were so focused on his injuries." Hope flickered in Harlan's chest, a tiny flame pushing back against the darkness. "You think he might have a chip?" He straightened in the chair, despite the pain it caused. "Worth trying." Rosalind pulled up Gravel's intake photos on her computer, clicking through several gruesome images. "Look here." She pointed to a small, scarred patch visible beneath the dirt and matted fur on the dog's neck. "This could be where someone removed a chip. But sometimes they miss, or don't get it all. Amateurs usually don't know exactly where to look." Harlan leaned closer, studying the image. The dog in the photo looked so broken, so far from the fierce protector who'd tried to defend him last night. Gravel's ribs had protruded sharply, his fur matted with blood and filth, eyes hollow with suffering. Yet something essential had remained unbroken in those amber depths. "If we find something, then we'll have proof he belonged to someone else before Kellerman," Rosalind finished. She tapped a few keys, accessing a database. The blue glow of the screen illuminated her determined face. "Let me just run the scanner's history through the system. See if it picked up anything we missed during intake. Sometimes these partial readings don't register right away." For a long moment, only the click of keys and Rosalind's muttered commentary filled the silence. Harlan held his breath, trying not to hope too much. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, marking each second of suspense. Then, "Beep!" They both jumped as the computer chimed. A new window popped up, text scrolling across the screen, line after line of official information. "Oh my God," Rosalind breathed, her fingers frozen over the keyboard. Harlan's hands gripped the edge of the desk, knuckles turning white with tension. "What? What is it?" He tried to decipher the technical information flooding the screen. "He's not just chipped, he's registered. This is a service dog ID." Her eyes widened as she read, scanning faster down the page. "His name is Scout. He was a certified K9 arson detection dog in Marion County, reported stolen 8 months ago after his handler died in the line of duty." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Someone took him right after the funeral." The words hit Harlan like physical blows. Scout. Not just a stray, but a trained professional. A hero. Every detail clicked into place. The way he circled those boot prints with practiced precision, his violent reaction to the gas cans, his protective instincts still sharp beneath layers of fear and abuse. The dog he'd been fighting for had once been someone important, someone valued. "Print it," he said urgently, fever bright with discovery. "Print everything." Rosalind was already hitting buttons, her movements quick and decisive. The printer whirred to life, spitting out page after page of documentation. service records, training certificates, the theft report, photos of a healthier, prouder version of the dog Harlan had come to know, standing tall beside a uniformed officer with a kind face. "This is bigger than just dogfighting," Rosalind said quietly, gathering the papers as they emerged. "A stolen police dog, suspicious fires, Kellerman somehow profiting from it all." She shook her head, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "No wonder they broke in here to get him back. Scout could probably identify accelerants, maybe even specific locations. He's a walking piece of evidence." Harlan gathered the warm papers, holding them like something precious. The despair that had weighed him down since last night transformed into steel-hard purpose. This wasn't just about saving one broken dog anymore. This was about exposing corruption that had poisoned their whole town, tentacles of greed reaching into places they shouldn't be. "We need to take this to someone," Rosalind said, pacing a small circle in the cramped office. "Someone higher up than Deputy Finch. The state police, maybe—" "No." Harlan's voice was firm, surprising both of them with its authority. "First, we need to get Scout out. These papers prove Kellerman stole him, but that won't matter if they hurt him worse or make him disappear before we can use them." His fingers tightened on the evidence in his hands, wrinkling the edges of the papers. "We need a plan, something they won't see coming." Harlan spread a crumpled sheet of paper across Rosalind's desk, smoothing out the wrinkles with trembling hands. Using a stubby pencil worn down to half its original length, he began sketching the salvage yard's layout from memory. His cuts stung as he worked, the raw scrapes on his knuckles pulling tight against scabbing skin. But he ignored the discomfort, focusing instead on capturing every crucial detail with fierce concentration. "The main gate's here," he murmured, marking an X with deliberate precision. "2 cameras, one points directly at the entrance, the other sweeps the parking area on a 30-second rotation." His pencil moved methodically across the paper, outlining buildings and barriers. "There's a gap in the fence behind these stacks of crushed cars. The camera can't see it because of the angle. The metal's all twisted inward like somebody tried forcing their way out once." Rosalind leaned over his shoulder, her coffee-scented breath warm against his ear as she studied the rough map. Her brow furrowed with concern. "What about guard dogs? Do they have more than one?" "Just Scout." Harlan's jaw tightened, a muscle pulsing beneath the skin. "They keep him chained near the shack, right here." He tapped the paper hard enough to leave an indent. "It's like they're mocking him, making a police dog guard their operation. He gets about 6 feet of chain, barely enough to lie, down properly. There's a rusty water bowl that was half empty when I saw it." Thunder rumbled in the distance, a low, threatening growl that seemed to emphasize his words, and both glanced instinctively toward the shelter's window. Dark, bruise-colored clouds were gathering over the river, their underbellies flickering with distant lightning, promising a heavy storm by nightfall. "The weather report says it'll hit tomorrow evening," Rosalind said, her fingers flying across her phone screen. She pulled up the forecast and tilted it toward Harlan. "Heavy rain, thunderstorms, maybe even flash flood warnings for the lowlands. Could work in our favor. The noise will cover any sounds we make, and visibility will be terrible." "We?" Harlan looked up sharply, alarm flashing across his face. "You can't come. It's too dangerous. These guys, you don't know what they'd do if they caught us." Rosalind crossed her arms, the fabric of her shelter scrubs stretching across her shoulders. Her eyes held a determination that mirrored his own. "You're right. I'm not coming in with you. But I can help another way." She grabbed a notepad decorated with paw prints and a chewed-up pen. "I'll call Deputy Finch tomorrow at 8 o'clock sharp. Report suspicious activity at the old paper mill on the other side of town. He's always paranoid about teenagers breaking in there. That should keep him busy for at least 30 minutes, maybe longer if I sound convincing enough." Harlan nodded slowly, the beginnings of a plan taking shape in his mind. That gives me a window. Not much, but enough if I'm careful. He turned back to his map, adding more details, the height of fences, locations of floodlights, areas of shadow where he could conceal himself. I'll need some supplies. Nothing fancy, just practical stuff. Over the next hour, they gathered what they could from around the shelter, building their makeshift rescue kit with desperate ingenuity. Rosalind found a half-used roll of duct tape in the shelter's maintenance closet, perfect for covering any reflective surfaces that might catch light or for securing torn clothing if necessary. From the laundry room, Harlan salvaged a length of clothesline, softer and quieter than a regular leash, less likely to spook a frightened dog. His old flashlight, carefully wrapped in black electrical tape to dim its beam to a narrow sliver of light, completed the basic kit. Take these too. Rosalind pressed a handful of liver-scented dog treats into his palm, her fingers lingering on his for a moment of silent encouragement. They're his favorite from when he was here. He never turned these down, even on his worst days. Might help calm him down if he's panicking. Harlan pocketed the treats, feeling their oily texture through the thin fabric of his jeans, then carefully folded his map along crisp lines. Outside, the storm was getting closer, the space between lightning and thunder shrinking with each flash. Lightning flickered across the sky, illuminating the shelter's stark cinder block walls in brief, harsh flashes of electric blue. I should get some sleep, he said, though they both knew rest would be nearly impossible with tomorrow's danger looming before them. Tomorrow night. Wait. Rosalind grabbed a piece of paper and scribbled quickly, her handwriting slanting with urgency. My cell number. My personal one, not the shelter phone. If anything goes wrong, if you need help. She pressed it into his hand, her fingers warm against his cold ones. Promise you'll call, no matter what time, no matter what happens. Harlan tucked the number away with the map, feeling the weight of her concern like a protective shield. I promise. He gathered his supplies into an old backpack Rosalind had found abandoned in the shelter's lost and found box, checking each item one final time with methodical care. The weight of what he was planning settled over him like the approaching storm, heavy, inevitable, terrifying. Tomorrow, he would face men who wouldn't hesitate to hurt him, men who had already proven their cruelty through Scout's scars and his own bruises. The thought made his ribs ache where they'd kicked him, but it didn't shake his resolve. If anything, the pain only hardened his determination. Thunder cracked overhead, close enough to rattle the windows, the sound like breaking bones. Through the shelter's rain-streaked windows, lightning revealed the river beyond, its waters dark and choppy, whipped into angry peaks by the wind. Harlan watched the storm roll in, using its wild energy to steel his nerves. In 24 hours, he would either succeed in freeing Scout or... He pushed the thought away, swallowing the lump of fear in his throat. Failure wasn't an option. Not anymore. Not with proof of Scout's true identity burning a hole in his pocket, the certification tag he'd glimpsed beneath matted fur, the distinctive way the dog responded to certain commands despite years of abuse. The dog had protected him in the salvage yard, placing his scarred body between Harlan and danger, despite everything humans had done to him. Now it was Harlan's turn to protect Scout, whatever the cost. He shouldered his backpack, its meager contents feeling somehow heavier with purpose, weighted with responsibility and fragile hope. 8 o'clock tomorrow, he confirmed with Rosalind, their eyes meeting in silent acknowledgement of all that couldn't be said. I'll be ready. Rain drummed against Harlan's hood as he crouched behind a stack of crushed cars, watching the salvage yard's main gate. His sneakers were already soaked through, the mud trying to pull them off with each careful step. Water trickled down his neck despite the hood, sending icy rivulets down his spine. Lightning flickered overhead, illuminating the yard in stark bursts that made the twisted metal look alive. Hulking beasts frozen mid-movement, waiting for darkness to resume their slow crawl. 8 o'clock. Right on time, he heard Rosalind's car start up in the distance, the engine's growl barely audible above the storm. She'd be calling Deputy Finch any minute now, sending him to the other side of town on a wild goose chase about loose dogs near the elementary school. Harlan counted to 60 in his head, each number pulsing with his heartbeat, then moved. The gap in the fence was right where he remembered, partially hidden behind a mountain of rusted appliances, washing machines stacked atop ancient refrigerators, their doors hanging open like screaming mouths. He squeezed through, wincing as the wire scratched his arm, leaving a thin line of blood that the rain immediately washed away. The yard looked different at night, transformed by shadows and rain into a maze of looming shapes. Lightning flashed again, helping him get his bearings, casting everything in a harsh blue-white glare that burned after-images onto his retinas. Thunder rolled across the sky as he picked his way forward, using the piled cars as cover. Each step had to be placed carefully. The ground was littered with sharp metal and broken glass that glinted dangerously with every lightning strike. The mud sucked at his shoes, threatening to betray him with every squelch. Twice he nearly lost his footing, catching himself on jagged metal that bit into his palms. A familiar bark cut through the storm's rumble. "Scout!" The sound sent a surge of determination through Harlan's chest. He oriented himself toward the sound, moving from shadow to shadow like he'd practiced in his head 100 times. The dog's chain rattled against concrete, and another bark echoed off the metal walls around them, this one more desperate, as if Scout somehow sensed rescue was near. "I'm coming," Harlan whispered, though the words were lost to the wind that whipped rain sideways into his face. The tarped shack loomed ahead, a dark shape against the stormy sky, blue tarp flapping violently at one corner where it had torn free. Scout's barking grew more intense, higher pitched with excitement or fear. Harlan pressed himself against the wall, feeling the rough wood through his wet jacket, splinters catching on the fabric. His hands shook as he found the door latch, fingers numb with cold and fear. Inside, the air hit him like a punch, sharp chemical smells mixed with worse things, urine, blood, and the sour stench of fear. Lightning illuminated the interior in crude snapshots, chains bolted to support beams, stained mats on the floor covered in dark patches he didn't want to identify, stacks of metal drums in the corner leaking rust-colored liquid. Scout strained against his chain, whining softly, his ash-gray coat matted and dull in the momentary light. "Easy, boy," Harlan breathed, approaching slowly with his hand outstretched. He pulled a treat from his pocket, letting Scout catch the scent through the competing odors. "Remember these? From the shelter? Rosalind gave them to me special." The dog's tail wagged cautiously, amber eyes reflecting what little light filtered through the cracks in the walls. Harlan knelt beside him, offering the treat while his other hand worked at the chain's clasp, fingers searching for the mechanism Rosalind had described. The metal was slick with rain, making his fingers slip repeatedly against the cold surface. Scout pressed against his leg, trembling, his warm breath puffing against Harlan's wrist. A sound cut through the storm, the distinctive crunch of tires on gravel, followed by the low rumble of an engine. Harlan's heart seized, a cold fist squeezing the air from his lungs. Headlights swept across the yard, far too early, casting moving shadows through the gaps in the walls. Kellerman wasn't supposed to be back yet. Not for hours. The plan was falling apart right before his eyes. No, 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 Harlan muttered, fumbling with the chain, panic making his movements clumsy. Finally, it gave way with a quiet click that seemed impossibly loud in his ears. He quickly attached the clothesline to Scout's collar, wrapping it twice for security, then looked around frantically, searching for an escape route that didn't exist. The headlights were getting closer, cutting through the rain in twin beams that swept across the yard like searchlights. In seconds, they would reach the shack. Harlan grabbed Scout's collar and pulled him toward the drums in the corner, the dog limping slightly but following without resistance. They crouched in the shadows, the dog pressing close against him as if seeking protection. Harlan could feel Scout's heart hammering through his ribs, matching his own desperate rhythm. The dog's torn ear twitched at every sound, his scarred muzzle resting against Harlan's knee. A car door slammed with a metallic bang that made Scout flinch. Footsteps splashed through puddles, approaching the shack with deliberate heaviness. Harlan held his breath, one hand gripping the makeshift leash while the other buried itself in Scout's fur, trying to keep them both still. He could feel Scout trembling, muscles tensed to bolt. The storm raged outside, a mirror of his own terror, but beneath it was something else, a core of stubborn defiance that refused to give up, that wouldn't let this broken, loyal creature suffer anymore. Thunder cracked directly overhead like a gunshot as the shack's door creaked open, letting in a gust of rain-laden wind. Harlan pressed deeper into the shadows behind the chemical drums, the sharp smell burning his nostrils. He prayed the darkness and rain would be enough to hide them both, Scout's gray coat blending with the shadows, his own dark clothing disappearing into the gloom. In the doorway, a massive silhouette stood framed by lightning, water streaming from a slicker as the figure peered into the darkness where a dog should have been chained, but wasn't. Through the drumming rain, Kellerman's heavy boots splashed closer, each footfall sending muddy water spraying into the home night air. The shack's door groaned open on rusted hinges, protesting the intrusion and letting in a jagged slice of dim light that cut through the darkness like a dull knife. Harlan pressed himself and Scout deeper into the shadows behind the oil drums, hardly daring to breathe. His heart pounded so loudly in his ears he was certain it would give them away. The dog's warm body trembled against him, but remained deathly silent. "Stupid paperwork," Kellerman muttered, shaking water from his jacket with violent flicks of his massive hands. Droplets scattered across the filthy floor. "Everything's got to have documentation these days. Insurance companies getting too nosy, poking around where they don't belong." His flashlight beam swept the room in erratic patterns, passing just over their hiding spot. Harlan ducked his head lower, feeling the cold metal of the drum against his spine. Thunder rolled across the sky, rattling the tin roof as Kellerman moved toward a metal shelf bolted to the far wall, pulling down a thick, dog-eared folder that bulged with papers. His meaty fingers thumbed through the contents with surprising delicacy. "Time to clean house? Can't leave any loose ends? Not with the feds sniffing around?" The sound of papers shuffling mixed with the storm's assault on the rickety structure, creating a symphony of impending destruction. Scout's body went rigid against Harlan's leg, muscles tensing beneath his scarred gray coat. The dog's nose twitched rapidly, and a low whine built in his throat. Not fear this time, but recognition. His amber eyes fixed on something across the room with unnerving intensity. Harlan remembered what he'd learned about Scout's training from the newspaper clippings he'd found. The dog could smell accelerants, knew what they meant. He'd been trained for this very purpose before Kellerman had stolen him away. His suspicion crystallized into horrible certainty as Kellerman grabbed a battered red gas can from beneath the desk, its metal surface dented and stained with use. The man was going to burn it all: the fighting records, the stolen dog, the evidence of whatever other crimes he'd committed here. The erasure of truth through fire, just like at the mill where Harlan's father had died. Scout's warning whine grew louder, his torn ear flicking back and forth in agitation. Harlan's heart hammered against his ribcage, but something stronger than fear, a white-hot sense of justice that had been building since his father's death, pushed him to his feet. He couldn't let this happen. Not again. Not when he finally had a chance to expose the truth. "Stop," Harlan said, stepping out from behind the drums. His voice shook but held firm, carrying through the rain-filled air. "I know what you did. I know who he really is." Kellerman spun around, fuel sloshing noisily in the can, his face contorting from surprise to rage in an instant. The flashlight beam caught Harlan full in the face, momentarily blinding him. "You little—" "His name is Scout," Harlan pressed on, the words tumbling out before Kellerman could finish his threat. Each syllable felt like both a shield and a weapon. "He was a K-9 officer. You stole him after his handler died, used him for fights. But that wasn't all, was it? You needed him because he could smell the accelerants, the ones you used at the mill, the same ones that killed my dad and 12 others." "Shut up!" Kellerman lunged forward with unexpected speed for a man his size, massive arms swinging in a vicious arc. The gas can caught Harlan in the chest with crushing force, knocking him backward. He hit the floor hard, the impact driving the air from his lungs as fuel splashed across the wooden planks, soaking into his clothes and sending rivulets of clear liquid between the floorboards. The chemical stench filled his nose, burning his nostrils and making his eyes water. Scout barked sharply, his training finally overcoming his fear completely. He circled Harlan protectively, hackles raised. Lightning flashed through the gaps in the walls, illuminating the scene in stark white. And in that instant, Harlan saw the spark, a tiny point of light that seemed to hang suspended in the fuel-saturated air. Maybe it was static electricity from the storm. Maybe a loose wire from the ancient electrical system. But the fumes ignited with a whoosh that seemed to suck all the oxygen from the room, flames racing across the spilled fuel in blue-orange fingers. Smoke billowed up, thick and choking, curling toward the ceiling in deadly plumes. "No!" Kellerman stumbled back, coughing violently, his face twisted with panic. Fire climbed the walls with desperate, hungry speed, fed by decades of oil and chemicals soaked into the wood. The ancient timbers crackled and popped as they surrendered to the blaze. Harlan couldn't see through the thickening smoke, could barely breathe as his lungs burned for clean air. But he felt Scout's wet nose against his hand, insistent and purposeful, heard the urgent, commanding bark. Training kicking in again. The dog knew how to handle fires, knew how to save lives when flames threatened to consume everything. Fumbling in his pocket with trembling fingers, Harlan pulled out the frayed laundry line he'd carried since rescuing Scout. His fingers shook violently as he clipped it to Scout's makeshift harness, but the knot held firm despite his clumsy movements. The dog pulled him with surprising strength toward the wall, where rotted boards had created a gap just big enough to squeeze through, a path to survival Harlan hadn't even noticed. The heat was overwhelming now, pressing against his skin like a physical weight. The smoke so thick he could only see Scout's gray shape ahead of him, a ghost leading him through hell. But Harlan wouldn't leave, not without the dog, not without proof. His hand found the folder Kellerman had dropped, now scattered across the floor, papers fluttering in the superheated air, grabbed what pages he could reach, cramming them inside his jacket as Scout tugged him relentlessly toward escape. The flames roared louder, a hungry beast consuming everything in their path. Through the smoke and chaos, Harlan could hear Kellerman shouting curses and threats, but he focused only on following Scout's lead, crawling on his hands and knees toward the promise of rain and clean air beyond the burning shack, each movement bringing them closer to freedom and justice. Through the inferno's hellish glow, Harlan spotted a shape crumpled near the doorway. One of Kellerman's men lay face down, overcome by smoke. The thug who'd threatened him days ago, the one who'd held Scout by the scruff and laughed while the dog whimpered, now lay helpless in the burning shack. Flames danced across the walls, casting writhing shadows over his motionless form as timbers crackled overhead. For a moment, Harlan hesitated. This man had hurt Scout, had helped Kellerman with his cruel schemes. He'd sneered when Harlan begged him to stop. But watching him lie there, vulnerable, something in Harlan's chest tightened. His father's words echoed in his memory, words spoken on their last fishing trip before the accident. Being good isn't about what others deserve. It's about who you choose to be when nobody's watching. That's the measure of a man's son. "Scout, help!" Harlan croaked through the smoke, his throat raw and burning. The dog understood immediately, amber eyes focusing with sudden purpose. Scout pressed close as Harlan grabbed the unconscious man's jacket, fingers curling into the leather. Together, they began dragging him toward the gap in the wall where rotted boards had given way. The heat was unbearable now, making every breath feel like swallowing fire. The air shimmered with it, scorching Harlan's lungs with each desperate gasp. Sweat and soot streaked down Harlan's face as he pulled with everything he had, muscles straining beyond what seemed possible. The man was heavy, dead weight against the rough floor that caught and snagged on his clothes. Scout strained forward in his harness, adding his strength to Harlan's desperate effort, paws scrabbling for purchase on the burning floorboards. Burning debris rained down around them, sending up showers of orange sparks that singed Harlan's already blistering arms and threatened to ignite his thin jacket. The roof groaned ominously overhead, a deep, threatening sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Wooden beams, weakened by flame, began to crack and splinter. A support post near the door gave way with a resounding snap. Time was running out. The whole structure could collapse any second. "Almost there," Harlan wheezed, though he wasn't sure if he was reassuring Scout or himself. His vision tunneled, darkness creeping in at the edges. The gap in the wall seemed miles away through the thick smoke that rolled and billowed in suffocating waves. His lungs burned with each labored breath, eyes streaming from the acrid fumes that stung like needles. Scout suddenly barked sharply, urgently, a sound with purpose that cut through the roar of flames. The dog lunged forward with renewed determination, powerful muscles bunching under his ash-gray coat, practically dragging both Harlan and the unconscious man the final few feet. They reached the rotted boards just as a massive crash shook the shack, sending a shower of fiery debris down where they'd stood seconds before. Scout forced his way through first, his powerful body breaking the opening wider, splinters flying. Rain hit his ash-gray coat, turning it darker as rivulets cut through the soot and ash. He turned back immediately, amber eyes locked on Harlan, refusing to leave without him. With one final surge of desperate strength Harlan didn't know he possessed, he heaved the thug through the gap. They tumbled into the mud together as thunder crashed overhead, a deafening boom that seemed to shake the very earth. The cold rain felt like heaven against Harlan's scorched skin, sizzling slightly as it hit his overheated body. Behind them, the shack's roof finally gave in with a deafening roar that drowned even the thunder. Flames shot skyward in a furious column as the structure collapsed in on itself, sending a blast of heat that Harlan felt even yards away. Through the curtain of rain, Harlan saw Kellerman stagger out the front door, doubled over and coughing violently, barely escaping before the whole building came down. The yard boss's expensive jacket was ruined, torn, and smoldering at the edges. His face was blackened with soot, hair singed at the temples, his commanding presence diminished by fear and desperation. He looked nothing like the intimidating figure who'd terrorized the town, who'd made grown men tremble with just a glance. Now he was just a man, cornered and beaten by his own schemes, watching his empire literally go up in smoke. In the distance, sirens cut through the storm's fury, growing louder with each passing second. Deputy Finch was coming, right on schedule thanks to Rosalind's call from the shelter. The sound seemed to drain the last fight from Kellerman. Recognition dawned in his eyes. The game was up. He sank to his knees in the mud, wheezing and defeated, not even attempting to flee. Harlan's legs gave out beneath him. He collapsed beside Scout, gulping in the sweet, rain-cleaned air that felt like the first real breath he'd taken in hours. His hand found the dog's fur, feeling the strong, steady heartbeat beneath. They'd made it. Against all odds, they'd both made it. The evidence might be burning behind them, documents and ledgers turning to ash, but Harlan knew it didn't matter anymore. The truth had already escaped the flames. Scout's identity, Kellerman's crimes, all of it would come out now. Sometimes the most powerful evidence wasn't paper at all. It was the living proof sitting right beside him, an ash-gray dog with one torn ear and unshakable courage who'd once been trained to detect exactly what Kellerman had been hiding. The rain poured down in sheets now, washing away the soot and fear as red and blue lights began to flash through the salvage yard's gates, illuminating the wreckage in rhythmic pulses. Scout pressed close against Harlan's side, both of them trembling but alive, watching justice finally arrive through the storm. In the dog's amber eyes, Harlan saw something he recognized, the same thing he felt growing in his own heart. Not just survival, but the promise of something more. Through sheets of rain, Deputy Finch's flashlight beam cut across the smoking ruins of the shack. Steam rose where raindrops hit the still hot metal roof, creating an eerie fog that swirled around their ankles. The acrid smell of burnt wood and melted plastic hung in the air, stinging their nostrils with each breath. The deputy moved methodically, his weathered face grim as he surveyed the destruction. Boots squelching in the muddy earth as he carefully picked his way through what remained of the structure. The beam caught something metallic in the debris. Melted gasoline cans, their labels warped and blackened, the plastic twisted into grotesque shapes. Nearby lay heavy chains, rust-flecked and ominous, and what remained of a makeshift fighting ring. Splintered boards with deep claw marks that told stories of desperate struggles, blood-stained ropes frayed from repeated use, and cruel training tools, shock collars, steel-tipped prods, and weighted harnesses that made Harlan's stomach turn with a sickening lurch. Finch's light settled on Harlan's face, illuminating every detail in harsh relief. The boy was streaked with mud and soot, rivulets of rain cutting clean tracks down his dirty cheeks, his clothes soaked through and clinging to his thin frame. But his eyes held steady with unwavering resolve. There was a story written in those smudges, in the trembling fingers he kept buried in Scout's fur, in how neither boy nor dog would back away from the wreckage even as the storm intensified around them. "Tell me everything," Finch said, his voice quiet but firm over the drumming rain, his expression softening just slightly as he regarded the bedraggled pair before him. Before Harlan could speak, Scout's posture changed dramatically. The dog's torn ear twitched, his ears pricked forward with sudden intensity, his body going rigid with attention as if an electric current had passed through him. His intelligent amber eyes locked onto Kellerman's expensive boots, now caked with mud, and a low growl rumbled in his chest, vibrating against Harlan's fingers. It wasn't aggression, it was recognition, a memory surfacing through layers of fear and abuse. Finch noticed immediately, his experienced gaze sharpening. 20 years on the force had taught him to read subtle signs, to notice the things others missed. And this was anything but subtle. This was a trained response. Muscle memory, cutting through years of abuse like a knife through fog. "He's signaling," Finch muttered, crouching down slightly, watching Scout's unwavering focus with growing interest. "That's an accelerant alert if I've ever seen one. Same stance, same fixation. I've worked with these dogs before." The deputy pulled out his radio, water beating on its black surface as the rain continued to pour down relentlessly. "Dispatch, this is Finch. I need backup at Kellerman Salvage north side by the old storage units. Fire department's already en route, but get me the state fire marshal and K9 unit supervisor." He paused, shifting to pull out the crumpled, rain-spotted printed chip data Harlan had brought him earlier, squinting at it through the downpour. "Also run this ID number, K97249, registered to Millbrook County Fire Department." The radio crackled with confirmation as Finch read through the report that came back, his voice rising deliberately so that Brandt could hear every damning word over the storm. "K9 Officer Scout, certified arson detection, reported stolen following handler death 8 months ago." His eyes narrowed at Kellerman, who stood nearby with a mixture of defiance and growing panic on his ruddy face. "Same time frame as the mill fire that got you that insurance payout, isn't it, Brandt?" Kellerman tried to stand taller, to summon his usual intimidating presence, but his legs wobbled beneath him, betraying his fear. "This is ridiculous," he sputtered through smoke-roughened lungs, rainwater dripping from his chin. "You can't possibly believe the word of some worthless kid over mine. I'm a business owner, a pillar of this community." "Same accelerant pattern at the mill fire," Finch continued, speaking over him with cold precision, thumbing through the data on his phone protected under his raincoat. "Same dog that could have identified it, conveniently disappeared right after. And now here we are, with more gas cans and a stolen K9, who's still doing his job despite everything you put him through. The pieces fit together too well, Kellerman." 2 patrol cars pulled into the yard, tires spraying mud as they came to a stop, their lights painting the rain in alternating washes of red and blue that reflected off the puddles forming everywhere. Kellerman's face twisted with desperate rage, his mask of respectability finally slipping completely. "You've got nothing but a mutt and a lying kid. Do you know who I am in this town?" "I've got enough," Finch said firmly, nodding to the arriving officers who stepped out into the downpour. "And once we process this scene properly, I'll have more than enough to put you away for a long time. Arson, insurance fraud, animal cruelty, organizing illegal fights. The list keeps growing, Brandt." The officers moved in with practiced efficiency, ignoring Kellerman's blustering as they secured his wrists behind his back, despite his protests. The yard boss's threats and curses were lost in the downpour as they led him to a waiting car, his expensive boots slipping in the mud, leaving behind deep imprints that quickly filled with rainwater. Harlan watched it all through a haze of exhaustion, raindrops clinging to his eyelashes. The adrenaline that had carried him through the fire, through his desperate rescue of Scout and the confrontation with Kellerman, was fading, leaving him drained and suddenly aware of every ache in his body. Vindication mixed with a hollow sort of feeling. Not regret, but the empty space that follows when a long fight finally ends, when the monster you feared is revealed to be merely a man. Scout pressed against his leg, offering steady warmth despite his wet fur, his body trembling slightly from cold and lingering fear. The dog's eyes never left Kellerman until the patrol car door slammed shut with a decisive thunk, as if making sure his tormentor was truly gone, truly contained, and no longer a threat to either of them. "You did good, kid," Finch said quietly, resting a heavy hand on Harlan's shoulder, his touch reassuring. "Both of you did. Sometimes doing the right thing takes more courage than people expect, especially when nobody believes you at first, but the truth has a way of coming out, doesn't it?" The rain continued to fall, washing away the soot and the fear, cleansing the night of its darkness in steady, rhythmic waves. Justice had come at last, carried on the determination of a boy who refused to look away from cruelty and a dog who remembered his true purpose despite everything that had been done to break him. In the distance, the fire truck's sirens wailed, bringing help to douse the last of the flames. But for Harlan and Scout, the worst fires had already been extinguished. The morning sun filtered through threadbare curtains, casting warm patches across the worn floorboards of Harlan's small house. Outside, another news van idled at the curb, its satellite dish stretching toward the sky like a metal flower seeking light. Harlan pulled the curtain closed with a quiet sigh. "They're still out there," he muttered to Scout, who lay stretched across the living room floor, basking in a stripe of sunlight. The dog's tail thumped once against the floor in acknowledgement, but he didn't bother opening his eyes. The peaceful response made Harlan smile. Just weeks ago, any sudden movement would have sent Scout scrambling for cover. The phone rang again, the third time that morning. Harlan let it go to voicemail, already knowing what he'd hear. More reporters, wanting his story, calling him a heroic teen, and asking for interviews. The messages all sounded the same. Inspirational young man, brave stand against corruption, voice of the community. He didn't feel like any of those things. He'd just done what needed doing, what anyone should do when they saw something wrong. The headlines in the local paper made him uncomfortable. Local teen exposes criminal enterprise. Young hero saves K-9 officer. They made it sound bigger than it was, grander somehow. Roslyn had been a godsend, handling most of the press herself. She'd given statements about the shelter's role, explained the chip scanning process, and deflected the more intrusive questions away from Harlan. Her voice carried authority when she spoke about animal welfare and the importance of proper documentation. The reporters seemed to prefer her practiced responses to Harlan's awkward silences anyway. Deputy Finch had been equally protective, keeping the media circus at bay while he processed the mountain of paperwork the case had generated. He'd stopped by yesterday with good news, though his squad car had to inch through the cluster of news vans. "County judge signed off on it," he'd said, handing Harlan an official-looking document. Temporary custody of K-9 Officer Scout, awarded to one Harlan Pike. His weathered face had cracked into a rare smile. "Permanent placement hearing in 6 months, but between you and me, kid, it's just a formality. Nobody's going to separate you two after all this." The paper now sat on Harlan's kitchen table, next to a small cardboard box. Inside the box was his father's wrench, recently retrieved from the pawn shop. He'd used his first reward money, a small sum from the county for helping break the case, to buy it back. The tool meant something different now. Before, it had been a reminder of loss. Now it represented choice, choosing to help someone else, even when it hurt. Choosing to do right, even when it cost something precious. Scout's head lifted suddenly, ears perking towards the kitchen. Harlan heard it too. Footsteps on the back porch. But there was no tension in the dog's posture, no hint of the defensive crouch that had once been automatic. Instead, Scout's tail wagged as Roslyn appeared at the screen door, carrying 2 paper bags. "Brought you boys some lunch," she called through the mesh, "and some more of that special shampoo for Scout's scars. They're healing up nicely." Harlan let her in, grateful for both the food and the company. The house had been quiet since everything happened. Too quiet, sometimes, with just him and Scout. But it was a different kind of quiet than before. Not the hollow silence of loneliness, but the peaceful quiet of safety finally found. Roslyn set the bags on the counter and immediately began fussing over Scout, who soaked up the attention like sunshine. "The shelter's gotten 3 calls already about starting a K-9 rehabilitation program," she said, scratching behind his good ear. Seems you two have inspired some changes." Thunder rumbled in the distance, a spring storm rolling in off the river. Scout barely twitched, just shifted slightly closer to Harlan's legs. The change in this simple reaction still amazed the boy. No more panicked barking, no more trembling at loud noises. Just the casual movement of a dog seeking comfort from someone he trusted completely. Harlan opened the windows slightly, letting in the fresh, rain-scented breeze. It mixed with the lingering smell of dog shampoo from Scout's morning bath and the lavender soap Roslyn had brought last week. The house smelled different now, lived in, cared for. The musty scent of abandonment had been replaced by something warmer, something like home. "The newspaper called again," Roslyn mentioned, unpacking sandwiches. "I told them the same thing. You're not interested in interviews right now." "Thanks," Harlan said quietly, accepting a sandwich. I don't know what to say to them. It wasn't about being heroic or anything. It was just about Scout." Roslyn nodded, understanding in her eyes. Sometimes the most important stories are the simplest ones. You saw something wrong and you fixed it. That's all anyone needs to know. Scout moved between them, accepting gentle pets from both, his presence a steady reminder of why it had all been worth it. The rain started falling outside, pattering against the windows in a soothing rhythm. Inside, in this small house that had known so much loneliness, 3 survivors shared lunch and comfortable silence, while the world outside clamored for a story they already understood in their hearts. Harlan sat cross-legged on his narrow bed, the worn mattress dipping slightly under his weight, the springs beneath creaking in protest at his slightest movement. In his hands, his father's wrench gleamed dully in the afternoon light, filtering through the threadbare curtains, catching on the worn edges where countless hands had gripped the metal. He'd spent the entire morning carefully cleaning off years of rust and grime, meticulously scraping away at the accumulated history, wanting to restore it to how he remembered it looking in his father's capable, oil-stained hands, strong and purposeful, never hesitant. Scout lay stretched out beside him, his ash-gray body taking up more than his fair share of the small bed, one paw draped possessively over Harlan's knee. His chest rose and fell in the deep, steady rhythm of peaceful sleep, occasionally punctuated by tiny snores that whistled through his scarred muzzle, and made Harlan smile despite himself. The dog's torn ear twitched now and then, flicking as though swatting away invisible flies, chasing dreams that no longer seemed to frighten him into whimpering wakefulness as they once had. Through the open window, the constant murmur of the river drifted in, a perpetual conversation of water over stone, mixing with the rustling of fresh spring leaves and distant calls of returning birds. The sound had once seemed lonely to Harlan, a melancholy reminder of all the empty spaces in his life, all the voices that should have filled his small room but didn't. Now it felt different, like nature's own lullaby, a backdrop of continuity that felt soothing rather than isolating, a reminder that some things remained constant even when everything else changed. He ran his thumb over the wrench's smooth metal surface, feeling every nick and dent, remembering how his father would explain each tool's purpose with infinite patience, each repair's process with meticulous attention. "Everything can be fixed," he used to say, his voice low and certain, "if you've got the right tools and enough patience." His calloused hand would rest briefly on Harlan's shoulder then, a touch of reassurance. Harlan hadn't understood then that his father wasn't just talking about machines and broken motors, but about life itself. The past weeks had proven that truth in ways Harlan could never have anticipated. Kellerman's arrest had made headlines across 3 counties, splashed across papers that people tossed aside after breakfast, but the real story wasn't captured in black and white newsprint. It was here, in the quiet moments when Scout chose to rest his head on Harlan's knee, instead of flinching away at a sudden movement. It was in the way the dog's amber eyes now held steady confidence instead of darting fear, and how his tail wagged freely when greeting friends, rather than tucking between his legs at the sound of footsteps. Harlan set the wrench aside on his nightstand and gently ran his hand along Scout's side, feeling the raised lines of old scars beneath the ash-gray fur, mapping the geography of past cruelties. They would always be there, just like the memories of fighting pits and fear and desperate survival. But scars were just marks of survival now, badges of endurance rather than chains to the past. Scout stirred slightly at his touch, brown eyes opening to fix Harlan with a look of complete trust, a gift Harlan never took lightly, before drifting closed again with a contented sigh. The room around them was small and sparse, walls bearing the ghosts of previous tenants' picture hooks, but it felt different now than it had before Scout. Missing pieces had been filled in, not with things but with purpose and companionship. The empty chair by the window, once just a place to drape his jacket, now held Scout's special medicated shampoo and a brush with collected gray fur between its bristles. A new leash hung by the door, not a necessity anymore since Scout never strayed far, but a symbol of their connection, their chosen partnership. Even the ancient radiator that clanked through winter nights had been transformed, serving as an impromptu drying rack for Scout's freshly washed blanket that added a faint scent of soap to the room's usual mustiness. The world outside their window was still hard sometimes, unforgiving in its indifference. People still struggled paycheck to paycheck, justice wasn't always swift or certain, and life rarely offered easy answers to the questions that kept Harlan awake at night. But Harlan had learned something valuable through it all. One person's stubborn refusal to look away from wrong could ripple outward, creating change larger than themselves. And one dog's remarkable capacity to trust again, despite everything that had been done to him, could teach lessons about resilience and forgiveness that no words could capture or explain. Scout shifted in his sleep, pressing closer to Harlan's leg, seeking warmth and contact even in unconsciousness. The boy adjusted his position to accommodate his friend, careful not to disturb his rest, watching the way Scout's whiskers twitched with each breath. This was their true victory, not the headlines about corruption exposed or criminals caught, but this simple moment of shared peace and belonging. Two beings who had once been alone and adrift, learning to face life together, shoulder to shoulder. The river's song continued outside, eternal and changing all at once, surging with recent spring rains. Like the water flowing past their rust-belt town, life kept moving forward, unstoppable in its momentum. But now, in this small room with his loyal companion pressed against him, Harlan no longer felt like he was being swept along helplessly in the current. He had found his anchor in Scout's unwavering loyalty, just as Scout had found his in Harlan's steady care. The world that had seemed so cold and hostile had transformed in subtle but profound ways, not because it had actually changed its nature, but because neither of them had to face its challenges alone anymore. Harlan picked up the wrench again, turning it over to continue his careful restoration work, wiping away a spot he'd missed near the handle. Scout's gentle snores provided a rhythm to his methodical movements, a comforting percussion that reminded him that some things broken could indeed be made whole again with enough care and time. Not perfect, perhaps. There would always be marks and memories that couldn't be polished away, but whole enough to build something new from the remains of what was lost, something stronger and more resilient than before.